The day Lucy Ramsey arrived in Caldwell, Kansas, the summer of 1883 was already trying to kill everything it touched. The soil cracked like old pottery under the wheels of the stagecoach, and the wind carried grit that settled between your teeth and behind your eyelids and made you feel like the land itself was chewing you up and deciding whether you were worth swallowing. Lucy pressed her forehead against the smudged glass of the coach window and looked out at the burned yellow grass, the skeletal cottonwood trees along a dried creek bed, and the thin blue line of sky that seemed too far away to offer any real comfort. She was 24 years old, she had $43 sewn into the hem of her traveling skirt, and she had nowhere left to go that wasn't this. She had come from St. Louis, though calling it coming from somewhere implied she had left something behind worth naming. Her father had died 2 winters ago, the consumption taking him slow and mean. Her mother had been gone longer than that, gone in the way that meant she had simply walked out one morning and chosen not to come back, which was a different kind of death but one that left the same hollow in the chest. Lucy had worked at her aunt's dressmaking shop for 3 years after her father passed, and then her aunt had married a man who didn't like Lucy's manner of looking at him directly when she spoke, and the shop had become a place Lucy was no longer welcome. She had read the advertisement in the Kansas City paper while sitting on the steps of the boarding house, where she paid $6 a week to sleep in a room with 2 other women. It said, "Wanted, a capable woman for domestic work on a cattle ranch outside Caldwell, Kansas. Wages and room provided. Inquire Mr. M. Hayes, Sundown Ranch, Box 217, Caldwell." She had written the letter that same afternoon. The stagecoach pulled into Caldwell just past 2 o'clock, and the town was exactly what she expected a Kansas cattle town to be in the summer of 1883. The main street was wide enough to turn a full herd, which was its purpose, and the smell of cattle and dust and cookfire smoke was thick enough to wear. There was a general store, a livery, a hotel with a sagging porch, 2 saloons side by side like bad teeth in a jaw, a barber shop, a church with a bell that looked like it had lost an argument with a rifle at some point, and a post office that was also selling eggs out of a barrel by the door. People moved along the boardwalks with the particular kind of purpose that meant they were trying to get business done before the heat got any worse. Lucy climbed down from the coach, set her 2 traveling bags on the ground, straightened her hat, and looked around for someone who matched the image she had built in her mind of a man named M. Hayes. She had imagined someone middle-aged, perhaps with a beard gone mostly silver, the kind of weathered and reliable-looking man who ran cattle operations because his father had and his grandfather had and the land was in his bones. She had not imagined Marcus Hayes at all. He was standing beside a wagon on the far side of the street, talking to a man from the livery, and he turned his head toward the stagecoach arrival with the automatic alertness of someone who paid attention to everything that moved on his land, and then his eyes found her because she was the only person on the whole street who was standing still. He was somewhere around 30, she thought, perhaps 32, with the kind of face that had been shaped by outdoor work into something sharp and angular and honest. He was tall, lean through the hips in the way of a man who spent his days in the saddle, broad across the shoulders in the way that came from hauling and building, and doing the actual physical work of running a place, rather than just telling others to do it. He wore a hat that had seen considerable weather, a cotton shirt rolled to the elbows, and he had a way of standing that suggested he was prepared for the ground to shift under him at any moment. He crossed the street toward her, and even that walk told her things, unhurried but deliberate, a man who didn't waste motion. "Miss Ramsey," he said when he was close enough that she didn't have to strain to hear him over the street noise. "That's me," she said. She put her hand out the way her father had taught her, direct and firm, and Marcus Hayes looked at it for just a half-second before he shook it. His grip was exactly what she expected. Not the performance grip of a man trying to prove something, but the real grip of someone who forgot to be careful with his own strength. "Marcus Hayes," he said. I have the wagon. You can put your bags in the back." He reached for her larger bag before she could, which she chose not to object to on account of her shoulder already aching from the 2 days of travel. She took the smaller one herself and followed him to the wagon. They drove out of Caldwell heading southwest, and Marcus Hayes did not try to fill the silence with pleasantries, which Lucy found she respected more than she would have expected. She sat beside him on the wagon seat and watched the town fall away behind them, and the land open up into something that would have been beautiful if it weren't so clearly suffering. The grass was wrong. She could see that without knowing anything about cattle or ranching. It should have been taller, greener, more present. Instead, it was thin and pale, and there were stretches where the soil was simply bare, cracked into a pattern like old paint. "Has it been dry long?" she asked. Marcus looked at her sidelong. "Going on 2 years," he said. "That's a hard stretch." "Yes," he said, "it is." They were quiet again. She noticed he drove the horses with very light hands. The team was a good-looking pair of grays, well-fed considering the land, and they responded to him without any drama. "The advertisement said domestic work," Lucy said after a while. "I want to know what that means exactly before I've committed to a situation." He glanced at her again. She had the impression he was deciding whether to be annoyed by the question or to simply answer it. "Cooking for myself and 3 ranch hands," he said. "Keeping the house in order. There's a kitchen garden that needs keeping, though it's not producing what it should this year on account of the drought. Laundry, some mending. If you're willing, I could use help with the household accounts, figuring and writing." He paused. "I won't require anything that isn't in that list." She understood what he meant by the last sentence. It was a thing a man in his position had to say clearly, and the fact that he said it plainly rather than leaving it to implication told her something about him. "That's a fair list," she said. "I can do all of it." "The house isn't much," he said then, and his voice changed just slightly on that, a fraction of something she couldn't name. "The drought has taken it down some. I'll understand if you want to go back to Caldwell when you see it." "I've lived in places that weren't much," Lucy said. "I'm not afraid of a house." He said nothing, but she saw the set of his jaw change, something releasing in it. Sundown Ranch came into view about an hour out of Caldwell, and Marcus Hayes had not been wrong about the house. It was a solid structure, built from good lumber, but the paint had long since given up, and the drought had done what drought does to everything that tries to hold together without enough water. The front porch had a board gone soft on the left side, and the window boxes were empty. The yard between the house and the barn was hard-packed dirt with no pretense of anything growing in it. The barn itself was in better repair than the house, which told Lucy something about where Marcus Hayes put his priorities, which was entirely reasonable for a man who needed his livestock to survive. There were 3 men visible around the yard. One was at the water trough with a horse, one was repairing something on the fence line, and one was coming out of the barn with a look of purpose that evaporated when he saw the wagon. Marcus pulled the team to a stop and climbed down, and Lucy climbed down on her side before he could come around to assist her, which earned her another of those sidelong looks. "That's Eli, Cord, and Pete," Marcus said, gesturing at each man in turn. They were a varied collection. Eli was young, maybe 19, with a round, sunburned face and an eager quality. Cord was the one at the fence line, older, weathered, efficient-looking. Pete was the one from the barn, somewhere in his 40s, with a gray beard and a watchful expression. "This is Miss Ramsey," Marcus told them. "She'll be running the house." Eli's face broke into a grin that was entirely unguarded. "Glad to have you, Miss Ramsey. We've been eating Cord's cooking for 2 months, and I think it's trying to kill us." "I heard that," Cord said, from the fence line, not looking up. Pete looked at Lucy with the careful assessment of a man who had seen a lot of people come and go. He nodded once, which she understood to be a significant endorsement. Marcus showed her the house. Inside, it was cleaner than the exterior suggested, which she attributed to the fact that Marcus Hayes was not a man who lived in filth, even when his circumstances were strained. But the kitchen needed a serious attention, and there was a fine layer of the omnipresent Kansas dust on every flat surface, and the curtains in the front room were so faded they'd gone from whatever color they'd started to a uniform pale gray. The room she was given was small but private, with a window that faced east and a narrow iron bed and a washstand with a decent mirror. "There's water in the kitchen," he said, from the doorway of her room, not coming in. "I'll have the horses seen to. Supper's usually at 6. "I'll have something ready," she said. He nodded, and she heard his boots on the floorboards going back through the house and then the sound of the screen door. She stood alone in the small room and looked at her 2 bags sitting on the floor and then at herself in the mirror of the washstand. She looked tired. She looked like someone who had been traveling for 2 days on a hard coach seat, which was accurate. She also looked like herself, which was a woman with dark red hair that would not stay put, green eyes that her father had always said were too direct to be entirely polite, and a chin that several people in her life had described as stubborn, meaning she refused to lower it when people wanted her to. "All right," she said to the mirror quietly, meaning it as permission to begin. The kitchen, once she had assessed it properly, was workable. There was a cast iron stove that was temperamental but functional, decent pots, and a good skillet, flour and cornmeal and dried beans and salt pork in the pantry, and a root cellar off the back of the house that had onions and potatoes still in it. She made a cornbread and a pot of bean and salt pork stew that was simple but solid, and she put it on the table at 6 o'clock exactly. And the 3 ranch hands and Marcus Hayes came in from the yard and sat down, and there was a moment of something passing around the table that she recognized as relief. Not that she was anything special, but that there was a hot meal made with care and placed before them, and sometimes that is the whole of what people need to feel that something is right. Eli talked through most of supper, filling in the quiet with information about the ranch, the cattle, the neighbors, and a border collie named Senator who apparently had very strong opinions about which direction cattle should be moved in. Cord ate steadily and said little. Pete ate steadily and said nothing. Marcus ate with the focused attention of a man for whom food was fuel, but he looked up twice during the meal when Lucy said something, and both times he held the look for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before returning his attention to his plate. She noticed, because she was someone who noticed things. In the weeks that followed, Lucy found her rhythm in the house, and the house found its rhythm around her. She repaired the soft board on the porch herself, with lumber she found in the barn and a hammer and nails, which caused Pete to stand and watch with an expression she eventually understood was impressed. She got the kitchen garden producing again through the application of water hauled from the well twice a day in the morning cool, and the stubborn refusal to accept that things couldn't grow. Tomatoes came back, then some squash, then beans. She kept the house accounts in a ledger she found in the desk in the front room and corrected several mathematical errors she found there without comment, though she left the corrected figures where Marcus could see them. He saw them. He didn't say anything about it directly, but the next week he put the ledger on the kitchen table when she was doing the morning work and said, "I need to order supplies from the general store. Would you go over the list with me?" And that became a regular thing, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings with the ledger between them, talking through what the ranch needed and what it could afford. It was during those evenings that she began to know him in the way that you can only know someone when a table and practical business and shared worry are between you. He had inherited Sundown Ranch from his father 5 years ago. The ranch had been doing well until the drought. He had debt, not a catastrophic amount, but enough that 2 more bad years would put the place in genuine danger. He had 1,200 acres, 300 head of cattle that he was fighting to keep healthy through the dry summer, and he had turned down 2 offers to sell sections of the land because he could not bring himself to do it. Why not? She asked one evening, looking at the figures that told a clear story about what selling even a quarter section would do to their position. She caught herself thinking their position and pushed the thought aside. It would ease things considerably. Marcus looked at the ledger without speaking for a moment. The lamp on the table between them threw warm light across the planes of his face. "My father broke that land," he said finally. "Every piece of it. He came out here with nothing and he broke it by hand, and I watched him do it. He's buried in the east field." He was quiet again. "I'm not selling the field he's buried in." "That's the east quarter you mean," she said. "Yes." She looked at the figures. Then she looked at him. "Then we work with what's here," she said, and she used "we" without thinking about it, and this time she didn't catch herself. He looked at her across the lamp. His expression did something she couldn't entirely read, but whatever it was warm. "Yes," he said, "we do." The drought broke in a strange way. Not with the spectacular storm everyone was hoping for, but with a series of slow, soaking rains that came over 3 weeks in late August, persistent and gray and deeply welcome. Lucy stood on the porch in the first of those rains without a hat and let it fall on her face, her eyes closed. And she heard the screen door, and then she heard Marcus come to stand beside her, and she didn't open her eyes. "It's raining," she said, unnecessarily. "It is," he agreed from close beside her. "The garden is going to be very happy. So are the cattle." She opened her eyes. He was looking at her rather than at the rain. There was something in his face that she didn't know what to do with, something open and careful at the same time, and the rain was falling between them and on them both, and she looked back at him with the same directness she always gave everything. "You're getting wet," she said. "I don't mind," he said. They stood there in the rain for a while, not touching, not saying anything else, and eventually the rain intensified and she went inside and he followed. And nothing that was said directly, but something had shifted between them, something they were both aware of, and neither of them was quite ready to name it yet, and so they didn't. What Lucy didn't expect in those first months at Sundown Ranch was the loneliness of the nights. Not the kind of loneliness that comes from being alone, because she had been alone most of her life and had made a kind of peace with it. This was a different kind. The loneliness that comes from being close to someone and not quite close enough. She would hear Marcus in the front room in the evenings, moving through the house, the sound of his boots, the scrape of his chair, the low sound of him talking to Senator, the border collie who was allowed in the house after dark, and she would be in her room with her sewing or her reading, and the distance between them was only a wall, but it felt immense and deliberate. She had been badly burned once before. Not the kind of burning that left visible scars, but the kind that leaves you knowing exactly what fire feels like, and you carry that knowledge in your hands and you are careful about heat ever after. There had been a man in St. Louis, a lawyer's clerk named David Whitmore, who had made her believe for 8 months that they were building towards something. And then one Sunday afternoon he had explained, with genuine regret and genuine cowardice, that his family had arranged a match for him with someone more suitable. She had thanked him for his honesty and gone home and sat in her room above her aunt's shop and understood that she had let herself want something without making sure it was real first, and she had promised herself she would not do that again. So she was careful with Marcus Hayes. She was careful with the way she looked at him, and the way she let herself think about him in the quiet of the evenings. She was careful to be useful and competent and present without being soft about it. And she was careful to remember that she was hired help on a ranch, however comfortable it had begun to feel, and that hired help went elsewhere when the situation changed. But the ranch was changing, and not in the direction of elsewhere. The rains continued into September, and the grass came back with the particular fury of things that have been waiting underground for their chance. The cattle grew visibly stronger. The kitchen garden produced more than she could use, and she began to put things up in jars, lining the pantry shelves with tomatoes and beans and pickled squash. Eli helped her carry jars from the general store in Caldwell, talking the whole time about a girl he liked in town, a banker's daughter named Clara Hennessy, who he had spoken to exactly twice, and considered this a developing relationship. Lucy listened and gave him practical advice, and tried not to smile too much at his earnestness. It was Eli who told her, without meaning to, about what Marcus had been through before. They were on the porch one evening in late September, shelling beans for the next day's dinner, and Eli talked with the indiscriminate openness of the young, and somewhere in the middle of a long story about a cattle drive the previous spring, he said, "Marcus wasn't always like this. He was different when Sarah was here." Lucy kept her hands moving on the bean pods. "Who was Sarah?" Eli looked up, realized what he'd said, and had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I probably shouldn't say." "You've already started," Lucy said reasonably. Eli looked out at the yard where Marcus was visible near the barn, talking to Cord in the last of the evening light. "She was engaged to him," Eli said. "About 3 years ago. She'd come out from Ohio, family connection of some kind. She was here for about 4 months." He paused. "Then she decided the land was too hard and went back east, wrote him a letter saying she couldn't do it." Lucy looked at her hands on the beans. "That's a hard thing," she said. "Changed him," Eli said with the simple directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to be oblique about the obvious. "He was easier before that. He talks less now. He worries more." Eli glanced at the barn and then back at Lucy. "He's different with you, though. I notice things even when people don't think I do." Lucy said, "What do you notice?" Eli grinned, and it was the same unguarded grin he'd given her the first day. "He listens when you talk," he said. "He doesn't do that with most people." She didn't answer, but she was quiet for the rest of the bean shelling, and she was still thinking about it when she went to bed, and she was still thinking about it in the morning when she built the fire in the stove and put the coffee on and heard Marcus come through the kitchen doorway, the way he did every morning, exactly at 5:30. "Morning," he said. "Morning," she said, and handed him the first cup before it had even fully brewed, knowing he always took it that way, strong and half-brewed, and he took it without comment because by now the language of her small accommodations to his habits was something they both spoke without naming. He sat at the table. Senator came in behind him and arranged himself under Marcus's chair. And Lucy stood at the stove with her own cup and thought about how entirely ordinary this scene was, and how it did not feel ordinary to her at all, and she was still being careful, she told herself. She was still being careful. It was October when things shifted again, and this time the shifting came from outside rather than from the slow interior movement between them. A man came to the ranch on a Tuesday morning, riding a good horse and carrying himself with the particular confidence of someone who has decided that confidence is a sufficient substitute for character. His name was Bennett Greer, and Lucy learned within 5 minutes of his arrival that he owned the neighboring property to the east, a larger operation that had survived the drought better than Sundown, because Greer had access to a creek that ran year-round through his eastern boundary. He was 40-something, handsome in a calculated way, with the kind of easy manners that sit on top of something less easy underneath. He sat at the kitchen table while Marcus stood by the door, and Greer talked about the land the way people talk about things they intend to own. He had made Marcus an offer for the East Quarter, the same offer Marcus had already turned down twice before. "The land will keep struggling," Greer said. He had taken off his hat and set it on the table in a way that suggested he intended to stay. "Even with the rains coming back, you're carrying debt on a property that's been hemorrhaging productivity for 2 years. Be reasonable about it, Hayes." "I've been reasonable about it twice already," Marcus said. His voice was level and quiet, which Lucy had come to understand was not a sign of calm but of the opposite. "My answer is the same." Greer looked around the kitchen. He looked at Lucy with the kind of look that categorized people quickly and assigned them their place. "You've made some improvements," he said to Marcus, but looking at her. "This your woman?" The silence that followed was approximately the length of a held breath. "Miss Ramsey works for the ranch," Marcus said. Greer smiled, and it was a smile that had been deployed many times before in many situations. "Well," he said. He picked up his hat. "The offer stands. When you're ready to be practical, you know where to find me." He nodded to Lucy in a way that was meant to be charming and accomplished, only being offensive. Then he went out. They heard him ride away, and the yard was quiet, and Marcus was still standing by the door with that very still quality he had when he was working to keep something contained. "He comes by every few months," Marcus said, not turning around. "I gathered," Lucy said. She turned back to the stove and began stirring the pot she'd been working on when Greer arrived. "He's the kind of man who thinks patience is a strategy." "He's not wrong," Marcus said. "The math could get bad enough to make the East Quarter look necessary. Or the math could keep improving," Lucy said, "which it is." She heard him cross the kitchen, and then she felt him stop close behind her, closer than he usually stood, and she kept stirring the pot though her attention had left the pot entirely. "Lucy," he said. She turned. He was right there, closer than the usual polite distance, and his face was doing that thing again, that open and careful thing, and she looked at him directly because she had never learned any other way. "I want to say something," he said. "Then say it," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I don't know how to say it without being wrong about it," he said. He was looking at her with the same direct attention he gave to things that mattered to him, which she had observed he gave to very few things. "I know what you are here. I know what our arrangement is. I don't want to make it so that you feel you have to go." She understood what he was telling her, which was that he was afraid. Not of her, but of what happened if he said what he meant and it made her leave, the way the last woman had left, the way everyone left the broken land eventually. "Marcus," she said. She turned fully to face him, the spoon still in her hand. "I have been knowing what this was and what it might be becoming since approximately the second week I was here. I'm not going anywhere." He looked at her. Something in his face was working through something. "I'm not easy to live with," he said. "You are the most consistent person I have ever encountered in my life," she said, with such genuine feeling that it surprised them both. "You are here, every morning at 5:30, every evening at 6. You say what you mean and mean what you say. Do you have any idea how rare that is? The ranch is struggling," he said, not arguing. She understood. Just presenting the facts the way he always did, all the facts, even the ones against his own case. "I know the figures better than you do," she said, "and it's coming back. I'm not easy to talk to, Marcus." She looked at him with the most direct look she had. "You are the person I talk to most honestly of anyone I have ever known. You listen. You actually listen." Something in him gave way then, not dramatically, not the way things give way in stories, but in the quiet way that real things give way when they've been held too long under too much pressure. He put his hand up and touched her face, just his fingers on her jaw, the lightest possible contact, and looked at her like she was something he was still deciding whether he was allowed to believe in. She put her hand over his where it rested against her jaw. "I stay," she said. "That's what I'm telling you. I stay." He kissed her then, and it was not a dramatic kiss. It was slow and careful and entirely certain, the way he did everything. And she kissed him back with the same certainty. And the pot on the stove began to bubble loudly, and they both heard it and pulled apart, and she turned back to stir it, and he stayed where he was for a moment, just behind her, and then he said, "I should get back to the fence line," in a voice that was not entirely recovered, and she said, "You should," and she was smiling at the stove. And she heard him go out, and the screen door close, and she stood there smiling at a pot of bean soup for a good 30 seconds before she got herself back together. November came in cold and clean, the drought a memory that was already being revised into something less terrible in the way that hard times are revised once they're past, and the ranch felt different. Not transformed, not fixed, but inhabited differently, the way a house feels different when everyone in it is telling the truth. What had changed between Lucy and Marcus was not announced or performed for anyone, but it was visible in the way of things that are true. He walked closer to her. He found reasons to be in the kitchen in the evenings when before he had kept to the front room. She set 2 cups on the table instead of one without being asked. They talked in the evenings in a different register, personal things that required trust. And the trust had been built so slowly and carefully over months of the practical, and the daily that it was the kind of trust that holds. He told her about his father, who had come to Kansas from Tennessee in 1862, broken by the war on his way west, and had found the land and decided to break it back and see which of them won. He told her about learning to ride before he could properly walk, and about the winter when he was 11 when everything froze and his father had gone 3 nights without sleeping to keep the cattle from dying. He told her about Sarah, not with bitterness but with the honest assessment of someone who had figured out what had actually happened. She wasn't wrong, he said. The land was too hard for her, I just wished she'd known it before. Did you love her? Lucy asked. They were sitting on the repaired porch in the cold November evening, wrapped in their coats, the sky above them so full of stars it seemed excessive. I wanted to, Marcus said, which was more honest than most people would have been. I thought if I wanted to enough it would become the same thing. He was quiet. It wasn't. No, Lucy agreed. It isn't. He looked at her sidelong in the way she'd come to love, that look that came from the corner of his attention and held more in it than a straight-on look would. What about you? He asked. She told him about David Whitmore, plainly and without drama, because it was past enough now to tell plainly. I think I loved the idea of what we were building more than I loved him, she said, though at the time I wouldn't have been able to say that. What do you love? Marcus asked. He asked it simply, the way he asked things, not as a rhetorical move but as a genuine question requiring a genuine answer. She thought about it. The stars were very bright. Senator had followed them out and was sitting on the porch steps, watching the darkness for whatever border collies watch for in the dark. Mornings, she said. The early part when everything is just starting and nothing has gone wrong yet. Good bread, books, though there haven't been enough of those in my life. Watching things grow, being useful to someone who's worth being useful to. She paused. This porch, she said, right now. He reached across in the dark and found her hand and held it, and didn't say anything, and that was exactly right. The conversation that Eli had been anticipating for weeks, with the gleeful patience of someone watching a pot on the stove, happened on a December afternoon when the first real snow of the winter was coming down in fat, quiet flakes, and Lucy was making bread, and Marcus came in from the outside cold and stood in the kitchen doorway watching her work the dough. I need to talk to you about something, he said. She looked up. His expression was serious in the particular way it got when he was saying something important. She had learned to read him well enough to know the difference between serious about the land and serious about something else, and this was the latter. All right, she said. She kept her hands on the dough because her hands needed something to do. I don't want you to be here as the woman who works for the ranch, he said. He came into the kitchen and stood across the table from her. I want you to be here as the woman this ranch belongs to, alongside me. He reached into his breast pocket and put something on the flour-dusted table between them. It was a ring, plain gold, worn smooth from being in his pocket where he had apparently been carrying it for some time. It was my mother's, he said. She died when I was young. I've had it since. He looked at her. Lucy Ramsey, I'm asking you to stay, not because I need someone to run the house. Because this place is better with you in it, and I am better with you in it, and I have not felt about any piece of ground or any person the way I feel about those two things since before I can remember feeling anything. Lucy looked at the ring on the table. Then she looked at him. The snow was falling past the kitchen window behind him, white and quiet. You are the most terribly romantic person, she said, who has ever pretended not to be romantic in the history of people pretending not to be romantic. He blinked, and then something happened to his expression that was genuinely rare on his face, which was that he almost smiled. Is that a yes? Of course it's a yes, she said. She picked up the ring and held it out to him. Put it on properly. He came around the table and took the ring from her and took her flour-covered hand in his and slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit as though it had been made for her, which she chose to take as a sign. He looked at her hand in his for a moment, then looked up at her face. I love you, he said, as though it were a fact he was presenting, clean and direct. I know, she said. I love you too. He kissed her, and this time it was not the careful, tentative thing of the first time, but something more sure of itself. and she kissed him back with her flower-covered hands on his face, and Senator barked once from somewhere outside as though registering an opinion, and they broke apart laughing, which was, she thought, an excellent way to become engaged. Eli, when he heard, threw his hat in the air. Cord shook Marcus's hand for a long time and said, "Good." Pete looked at Lucy and said, "You're the best thing that's happened to this place in 5 years," which from Pete was practically a speech. They were married on a Saturday in February 1884, in the Caldwell Church with the bell that had seen better days. The ceremony was small because they were not people who needed a crowd to make a thing real. Lucy wore a dress she had made herself over the winter months, dark blue wool with pearl buttons down the front, and her red hair was pinned up with a tortoiseshell comb that had been her mother's, the one thing of her mother's she had kept. Marcus wore a dark jacket and a clean white shirt, and looked at her when she came down the church aisle with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life, which was the expression of a man who cannot quite believe the thing that is happening, but is entirely prepared to believe it. The minister read the words and they said them back, and Marcus said, "I do." With the same certainty he said everything, no hesitation, no qualifier, and she said, "I do," with the same certainty, and he put the ring on her finger again, the same ring, and it meant the same thing it had meant in the flower-covered kitchen, which was everything. Eli cried a little and tried to pretend he had something in his eye. The winter of 1884 was hard in the way that Kansas winters were hard, which was to say entirely and without apology, but it was not the desperate grinding hardness of the drought years. The cattle were stronger going into winter than they had been in 3 years. The pantry was full of the summer's putting up. The ledger showed a better picture than it had shown in a long time. Lucy made the house her own, not dramatically, not by destroying what had been there, but by adding to it the things that speak of someone intending to stay. She found curtain material in Caldwell, a deep red that she liked against the prairie light, and put up new curtains in the front room and the kitchen. She brought some of the books she'd had in storage at the boarding house in St. Louis, 12 of them, and arranged them on the shelf by the front room fireplace. She planted roses along the porch railing in the spring, and they took with a stubbornness that matched her own. Marcus watched all of this with a quiet pleasure that was not something he expressed in words, but was entirely visible if you knew how to look at him, which Lucy did. He had lived in the house for 5 years as a place to sleep between work and more work, a functional space rather than a home, and now it was becoming the second thing, and he understood the difference even if he couldn't have articulated it. They had their disagreements because they were both people with opinions, and because good marriages are not the absence of disagreement but the presence of respect within it. Their first real argument was about money, specifically about whether to take a small loan from the Caldwell Bank to invest in improving the cattle stock, which Lucy thought was a reasonable calculated risk, and Marcus thought was a step he wasn't willing to take. They sat across the ledger at the kitchen table and each made their case with full seriousness, and the argument was respectful and genuine and about 2 hours long, and eventually Marcus said, "Walk me through the figures again," and she did, and at the end he said, "All right. You're right," with the same directness he brought to everything, and she said, "Thank you for actually listening," and he said, "I always actually listen to you," and they were quiet a moment, and then she said, "Do you want more coffee?" And he said yes, and that was the end of the first argument. The loan was taken. The cattle stock was improved. The investment paid back within 18 months. Bennett Greer came by again in the spring, and Lucy answered the door. Greer was surprised to find her there in a different capacity than he had last assigned her, and the surprise was visible on his face for a moment before he reassembled his easy manners. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, because someone had evidently told him. "Mr. Greer," she said, "if you're here about the East Quarter, the answer is still no." He looked at her. "I'd like to speak to Marcus." "Of course," she said. "He's at the barn." "You can walk out if you like." She stepped back to let him in, and he came through the house and out the back and across the yard, and she watched from the porch. She couldn't hear what was said, but she watched Marcus's posture as Greer approached, and it was the same as it had always been with Greer, level and contained and entirely unmoved. Their exchange was brief. Greer left the way he had come, and Marcus came back across the yard and up the porch steps and looked at her. "Same offer," he said. "Same answer, I trust," she said. "Same answer," he said. And he touched the side of her face as he went past her into the house, so briefly and naturally that it was simply part of the language of their days, and she turned her face slightly into the touch the way she always did, and he went inside. Greer did not come back after that. Word got around in the way that word did in cattle country, the quiet, efficient transmission of information across the open land, that Sundown Ranch was not available, and its owners were not interested in discussing it, and that appeared to be that. The summer of 1884 was a good summer. The rains came in the right proportions, not too much, not too little, and the grass grew thick, and the cattle were fat, and Eli, emboldened by Lucy's advice over many months, had finally asked Clara Hennessy to walk out with him after church, which she had accepted, and Eli was in a state of continuous delighted incredulity that someone thought well enough of him to say yes. Lucy was in the kitchen on an August evening, the windows open to the warm night, reading a letter she had received that day from her aunt in St. Louis, which was the first communication she had received from that woman in 2 years. The aunt had apparently heard about the marriage, and was writing to offer her congratulations in the particular tone of someone who is offering congratulations from a position of having formerly been wrong about something, and not wanting to admit it too directly. Lucy read it twice, decided she bore the woman no particular ill will, wrote a civil and warm response that said without saying it that she was well and happy and had nothing to forgive, and sealed it and left it on the table to post. She set her hand on her stomach, where something was new. She had suspected for 3 weeks. She had said nothing because she wanted to be certain, and she was now certain. She was still sitting at the table when Marcus came in from his evening round of the property, Senator padding in behind him. He stopped when he saw her expression because her expression was not like usual. "What is it?" he said, immediately alert. She looked at him. She felt the smile come up from somewhere inside her that she couldn't have stopped if she tried. "Sit down," she said. He sat across from her, his eyes on her face, reading her the way he had learned to read her. "We are going to have a child," she said. The silence stretched for 1 full second and then another, and then Marcus Hayes, who was the most contained and measured person she had ever met, pressed his hands flat on the table and closed his eyes for a moment. And when he opened them, they were brighter than usual, and he said, in a voice that was the quietest she had ever heard him use, "Are you well? Are you feeling all right?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I feel wonderful." He was around the table before she had finished the sentence, and he knelt beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and he looked up at her with that expression she had first seen on their wedding day, the expression of a man who cannot quite believe the thing that is happening but is entirely prepared to believe it. And then he put his forehead against her hands, and she felt the full depth of what he was feeling, which was immense and quiet and entirely devoted. "Marcus," she said softly. "I know," he said, "I know." Their son, James, was born in April of 1885, which was a good month for beginnings, when the Kansas spring was doing what it did, which was arriving without hesitation. The birth was long and hard in the way that first births often are, and Lucy worked through it with the same stubborn focus she brought to everything difficult. And when it was over and the baby was placed on her chest, she held him and looked at him with the thoroughness of someone making an inventory of something very important. He had dark hair, nearly black, which was his father's, and eyes that were still the undecided blue of newborns but which looked likely to settle into green. Marcus sat beside the bed and held his son for the first time with the particular carefully controlled panic of a large man holding something very small, and his face was something that Lucy committed to permanent memory because it was the most open she had ever seen him, all the containment gone, all the reserve set aside, just a man entirely undone by love. "James," Marcus said, testing the name. "James," Lucy agreed. "My father's name," Marcus said quietly. "I know," she said. "That's why I said yes to it." He looked at her over the baby's head, and what was in his eyes was not a thing she could name easily, only that it was large and permanent and directed entirely at her. James grew in the way that children grow on working ranches, which is to say quickly and with considerable dirt involved. He was walking by 11 months, which Lucy attributed to stubbornness, inherited equally from both parents. By the time he was 2, he followed Marcus around the yard with the dogged devotion of a second shadow, and Marcus bore this with a patience that Lucy found deeply moving, crouching down to explain things to a toddler, pointing out the horses and the cattle and the fence posts with the same seriousness he applied to explaining the ledger figures. Eli married Clara Hennessy in the spring of 1886 in the same Caldwell church, and Lucy made the wedding dress because Clara had asked her to. And it was the finest piece of sewing she had done since her aunt's shop, and Clara wore it beautifully, and Eli stood at the altar with the expression of a man who cannot believe his luck, which was exactly right. Pete retired that same year and moved to live with his sister in Wichita, which he had been planning for some time. They gave him a good farewell supper, and Marcus shook his hand for a long time and said, "You kept this place together when it was hard," and Pete said, "So did you." And that was the truest thing either of them said. A new hand came on that autumn, a young man named George Tucker, 20 years old and willing to learn everything, and Lucy watched Marcus teach him with the same patient thoroughness he brought to explaining things to James, and she thought about the kind of man who was good at teaching without needing to be recognized for it. The years at Sundown Ranch built themselves in the way that good years do, each one adding something to what the last had laid down. The cattle operation grew steadily, not explosively, but the sustainable kind of growth that doesn't require anything to be sacrificed. Lucy kept the books with the precision of someone who understood that numbers were not abstract things, but the translation of real work into reality, and the books told a story that improved year by year. They paid off the bank loan in 1887. They improved the barn in 1888. They put in a proper root cellar that winter, dug deep enough that it held the temperature through even the hottest summer, and Lucy felt an unreasonable satisfaction about this root cellar that she mentioned to Marcus, who said that a good root cellar was an entirely reasonable thing to feel satisfied about, which she loved him for. James, at 3, discovered the roses along the porch railing and had opinions about them that were more destructive than appreciative. But Lucy replanted what needed replanting and redirected his energy toward the vegetable garden, where he could be as enthusiastic as he liked. She found, as the years went on, that the woman she had been on the stagecoach coming into Caldwell, the woman with $43 in her hem and nowhere left to go, was both completely herself and completely different from who she was now. The $43 in the hem had been the last of a series of provisions against a world that had not, up to that point, given her much reason to feel secure. She didn't need provisions like that now. Not because Marcus would provide everything for her. She had never been the kind of woman who wanted that, but because she had built something alongside someone who was worth building alongside. And the thing they had built together was solid in the way that things are solid when they are made of honest materials. In the autumn of 1888, Lucy sat on the porch in the evening and watched the land go golden in the sunset, the way it did in October, the grass and the hills and the sky going through a sequence of amber and rose and deep purple that was, she thought, genuinely excessive in its beauty. Marcus sat beside her. James was in the house with Eli's wife Clara, who had brought their 18-month-old daughter, and the sounds of small children being managed by one slightly overwhelmed Clara came through the open window in intermittent waves. Senator lay at Marcus's feet, old now, the black and white fur gone gray around his muzzle, still watchful. "I want to tell you something," Lucy said. Marcus looked at her. He still looked at her the same way, that full attention, all of it, nothing held back. "I am going to have another child," she said. He reached for her hand, the way he always did, finding it without looking, because they had sat side by side enough times now that the geography was mapped. "Are you well?" he said immediately, the same first question as always. "I am very well," she said. He was quiet for a moment, holding her hand, looking out at the land. Then he said, "I love you more than I know how to say." "I know," she said. "You've always been better at showing than saying." "Is that a criticism?" he asked with that almost smile. "It is absolutely not a criticism," she said. "It is one of the things I love most about you." Senator lifted his head and looked at them and then put it back down, satisfied with whatever he had assessed. The winter of 1888 into 1889 was the kind of winter that Kansas produced when it was reminding you that the good years were a courtesy, not a guarantee, and that the land's fundamental character was severity. The cold came hard in November and stayed hard through January, and the snow was deep in December, and the work of keeping the cattle alive in those conditions was exhausting and constant and demanded everything Marcus and the hands had. Lucy kept the house as warm as possible and kept the kitchen producing as efficiently as she could, and made sure there was always hot food and hot coffee when men came in from the cold, because that was the work she could do, and she did it entirely. She was heavily pregnant through the worst of the winter, and she refused to be reduced by it. She moved more slowly, yes, and Marcus watched her with the focused attention of someone prepared to catch whatever falls, and she let him watch without finding it intrusive because she understood by now that his watchfulness was his form of tenderness, the same way his listening was his form of closeness. Their second son, Daniel, was born in February 1889, in the deep cold, with the wind off the plains making the house creak and moan, and he came into the world with considerably less ceremony than his brother had, which the midwife attributed to Lucy knowing what she was doing this time. He was a large, healthy baby with Lucy's red-tinged hair and Marcus's gray eyes, and James, who was nearly 4, was presented with his brother the next morning and looked at him with an expression of cautious curiosity and then said, "He's very small," and Lucy said, "So were you," and James appeared to find this entirely implausible. Marcus held Daniel the way he had held James, with that carefully controlled emotion, but this time he was less panicked because he had done this before, and he sat beside the bed and held his second son and looked at Lucy with eyes that said, as they always had, that she was the foundation of everything he had. "This is a good life," she said to him from the pillow. "Yes," he said, "it is." The spring of 1889 brought news that changed the nature of the territory around them. The Oklahoma Territory land run was beginning, and across Kansas there was the particular restlessness that comes when land is suddenly available to those who can get there first, the massive scramble of April 22nd that sent thousands of people racing across a line to claim their futures. Eli and Clara talked about it, and Eli had a few days where the excitement of it made him restless and speculative, but Clara was sensible and pointed out that they had built something real in Caldwell, and that chasing new ground was for people who hadn't found the right ground yet, and Eli agreed with the particular speed of a man who knows his wife is right. Marcus and Lucy did not discuss it as a possibility for themselves. They did not need to. Their ground was here, and it was the ground that had been broken by Marcus's father, and it was the ground where Marcus's father was buried in the east field, and it was the ground where the roses grew along the porch railing, and it was the ground where James had taken his first steps and Daniel had been born, and it was sufficiently their ground that the question of other ground never truly arose. What the spring of 1889 brought to Sundown Ranch specifically was an offer of a grazing partnership from the neighboring ranch to the north, the Morrison property, run by an older couple, Frank and Ada Morrison, whose sons had both gone to the Oklahoma Territory and left them short-handed. It was a practical arrangement, sensible for both parties, and Lucy and Marcus worked out the terms over several evenings at the kitchen table, and it was the kind of business arrangement that required honesty and respect from both sides, which the Morrisons gave and received in kind. Ada Morrison became, over the months that followed, something Lucy had not had since leaving St. Louis, which was a friend. Ada was in her 60s and had been on the frontier since before Kansas was a state, and she had a forthright manner and a deep practical wisdom that Lucy found completely companionable. They visited back and forth through the summer and fall, and Ada taught Lucy things about preserving and herbal medicine that the older woman had accumulated over 40 years of frontier living, and Lucy taught Ada to use the double-entry bookkeeping system she had developed for the ranch accounts, which Ada found revelatory and adopted immediately. "You're a rare woman," Ada told her, one afternoon in the Morrison kitchen. "You came out here and you stayed." "Why wouldn't I?" Lucy asked. Ada looked at her with the particular wisdom of someone who had watched a great deal of frontier history. "Most of them can't bear the broken parts," Ada said. "The weather and the drought and the distance and the way the land just takes and doesn't always give back. Women especially. They come out here for the adventure of it, and then the adventure turns out to be hard, and they find they hadn't wanted the hard kind." Lucy thought about what Marcus had told her about Sarah. She thought about the stagecoach coming into Caldwell with the cracked earth and the skeletal trees and the thin blue sky. She thought about the broken board on the porch and the empty window boxes and the house that needed everything. "I think broken things are the only kind I know how to love," she said. It came out without being planned and once said it felt entirely true. "I grew up in broken things. I know how to live in them. I know that the broken parts aren't the end of the thing, they're just part of it." Ada looked at her for a long moment. "Marcus is lucky," she said simply. "I think we're both lucky," Lucy said, "and I think we both know it." The autumn of 1889 was when Marcus told her something he had not told her before, something he had been carrying in the particular private way that quiet men carry things they're not sure how to give to someone else. They were in the East Field, the one with his father's grave, which Lucy had tended quietly since the first spring she was there, keeping the grass around it from encroaching, putting wildflowers on it in the summer months. They were out there in the October light, James with them running ahead the way 4-year-olds run, and Daniel asleep against Marcus's chest in the carrier Lucy had made. Marcus stopped at his father's grave, and they stood there together in the easy silence of people who have learned to be comfortable with the things that can't be fixed, only honored. "I almost did sell this field," Marcus said, "the winter before you came. Greer's offer was the third offer and the drought had gone 16 months and I was behind on everything." He looked at the stone. "I sat at that desk in the front room for 4 hours one night with the papers in front of me. I'd signed everything except the deed transfer." Lucy was quiet, listening. "I couldn't sign it," he said. "I couldn't write my name on a paper that put my father's grave into Greer's hands." He looked at her. "I nearly did it for the practical reasons, and I couldn't do it for the impractical ones. And the next morning I wrote the advertisement for the paper, and a week later I had your letter." He was quiet. "Your letter was the first thing I'd read in a long time that sounded like a person being honest." "What did I say?" Lucy asked, genuinely wondering, because the letter was years past and she had written it in the practical directness of someone who had no time for embellishment. "You said, 'I am capable of hard work and I understand that a drought-affected ranch in an uncertain territory is not a comfortable position, but I am not looking for comfortable. I am looking for useful,'" Marcus said, with the precision of someone who had read a thing enough times to memorize it without intending to. She thought about the woman who had written that letter. The woman on the steps of the boarding house with $43 in her hem. "I meant every word," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I kept it." She looked at him. "You kept the letter. It's in the desk," he said. "In the left drawer." She thought about that for a moment, about the fact that he had kept her letter in the desk for years and never mentioned it because that was exactly him, That was exactly the way he carried the things that mattered to him, quietly and completely. "Marcus Hayes," she said. "Lucy Hayes," he said. James came running back toward them, dirty-kneed and breathless, with something he had found that he considered important, which turned out to be a smooth, flat stone that he presented to his father with great ceremony. Marcus took it with the same seriousness and said, "That's a good stone," and James was satisfied. Daniel slept against his father's chest, undisturbed. And the October light came down across the east field, and the Kansas sky when its enormous impossible blue above them, and the grave of William Hayes, who had come from Tennessee broken and had broken the land back and made something from it, was quiet and tended, and the ranch stretched away to the west in the good grass of a recovered year. The years that followed were, by any accounting, good years. Not without difficulty, because the land's fundamental nature was to test what was built on it, but good in the deep sense of the word, which is the sense that says the foundation is solid and the people standing on it know it. James turned 5 and then 6 and then 7, growing into a boy with his father's serious watchfulness and his mother's directness, which in combination produced someone who paid close attention and then said exactly what he saw, which was occasionally inconvenient but mostly admirable. He began to help Marcus with the morning rounds of the property when he was 7, riding in front of his father on the saddle, then on his own small horse that Marcus bought for him at the Caldwell livestock sale, a patient brown mare named Biscuit, who had the steady temperament of someone who had heard everything before and found none of it alarming. Daniel grew into a different kind of child, louder and more immediately emotional than his contained brother, but with a sweetness and a humor that was entirely his own. He found Lucy's sewing box at the age of 2 and redecorated Senator with a length of red ribbon, and Senator bore this with the patient dignity of an old dog who had lived long enough to have seen everything. Senator died in the autumn of 1890, in the way that good old dogs die, which is quietly and in his sleep, in his usual place by the kitchen stove. Marcus buried him under the cottonwood tree by the water trough, and James was solemn about it, and Daniel cried with the uncomplicated grief of children, and Marcus did not cry, but he was quieter than usual for several days, and Lucy did not fill the quiet with words but sat with him in it, because that was what the quiet needed. In the spring of 1891, a young border collie arrived at the ranch in the unclear way that animals find the places that need them, following Cord back from Caldwell one afternoon. She was black and white and already had strong opinions about which direction things should go, and James named her Penny, and she took up Senator's position by the kitchen stove with a confidence that suggested she had always known this was her post. Cord, who had been at the ranch longer than anyone except Marcus, retired himself in 1892, going to live with his daughter's family in Abilene, and Marcus hired 2 new hands, a pair of brothers named Sam and Joseph Adkins, who were hardworking and reliable and integrated themselves into the rhythm of the place without drama. George Tucker, who had been the young, willing-to-learn hand who joined them in 1886, had by now become the kind of capable, steady presence that the operation could not easily function without. He was 28, and he carried himself with the quiet competence of someone who had learned well and was not done learning. He had also, at some point during the last several years, developed a friendship with Ada Morrison's granddaughter, a serious young woman named Ruth who had come to stay with her grandparents for the summer, and had apparently decided that Caldwell and its surroundings suited her. Lucy watched this situation develop with the warm attention of someone who had been in that position once and knew what it looked like from the outside. She said nothing about it to George, because it wasn't her place, but she invited Ruth to supper at the ranch house several times that summer, and those suppers were pleasant occasions with good food and conversation. And George Tucker sat across the table from Ruth Adkins with the slightly dazed look of someone for whom the evening has exceeded all expectations. By October, Ruth had agreed to stay in Caldwell permanently, and George had asked Marcus for an increase in his wages, which Marcus gave without asking why, because he could see perfectly well why, and he discussed it with Lucy that evening and they both smiled about it without being excessive. The summer of 1893 brought a different kind of difficulty to Sundown Ranch, this one coming from the national situation rather than the local land. The financial panic that swept the country that year hit the cattle markets hard, and the prices for beef dropped sharply and stayed there. And this time, the difficulty was not one that could be solved by tending the kitchen garden or adjusting the ledger. It was systemic and external, and it required the kind of steady-headed planning that acknowledged real limits without giving in to despair. They sat at the kitchen table with the ledger between them and they worked through it together, the way they had worked through everything, with honesty and without flinching at the numbers. They decided to reduce the herd size, selling what they could at the current low prices to reduce the feed costs and the carrying expenses through the uncertain period. They decided to take on a contract with the Caldwell townspeople for a portion of the farm produce, which brought in a different kind of income that wasn't subject to the cattle market's collapse. They tightened the household accounts with the precision of two people who understood the difference between cutting what was unnecessary and cutting what was essential. Marcus, in those difficult months, was exactly himself, and she loved him specifically for that. He did not become smaller under pressure. He did not become inaccessible or cold or driven into himself in a way that locked her out. He was harder around the edges, which she understood was how he braced against things. But he came to the table every evening, and he told her what he saw, and he listened to what she saw, and they worked it together. "We've been here before," she told him one evening in the dark kitchen after the boys were in bed. "We have," he agreed. "We stayed," she said. "We stayed," he agreed. She reached across the table and took his hand the way he usually took hers. He looked at it, and then he looked at her, and the kitchen was quiet and the lamp was low, and outside the Kansas night was doing what it did, which was being enormous and indifferent and somehow not entirely unkind. "I would not trade this for anything that was easier," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers, fingers interlaced, firm and certain. "Neither would I," he said. The panic eased over 1894 and into 1895. The cattle prices recovering to something workable if not spectacular, and Sundown Ranch came through it the way it had come through the drought, not undamaged but intact, still on its 1,200 acres, still with Marcus's father in the east field and the roses along the porch railing and the books on the front room shelf. Lucy was 36 in the spring of 1895, and she looked at herself in the mirror of the washstand, the same mirror she had looked into on the first day she arrived with $43 in her hem, and she saw the years on her face, not unkindly. She had never been vain, but honestly. There were lines around her eyes from squinting into the Kansas sun and more lines from 10 years of laughing, and her red hair had a thread of silver at the temples that she had not made any effort to conceal, because concealment seemed beside the point. Marcus came up behind her in the mirror and put his arms around her from behind and looked at their reflections together, and she leaned back against him. "You look like yourself," he said. "I should hope so," she said. "I've been working at it for 36 years. He pressed his lips to the top of her head. "You look like the woman who showed up here in the middle of a drought and decided everything was fixable," he said. "Which is what you look like." She covered his hands with hers where they were crossed over her front. "I think a lot of things are fixable," she said. "Not everything, but a lot." James was 10 that year, riding out with his father on the full property rounds and already able to evaluate a section of grass or a section of fence line with the eye of someone who had been taught to really look. He was a quiet boy, her James, careful with words and careful with animals. The kind of child who made you think he was listening all the time even when no one was talking to him. He had Marcus's face and Lucy's coloring, the dark hair gone auburn in the summer, and he would grow into a fine man, she thought, not because she was his mother, but because she could see what he was. Daniel at 6 was the opposite of his brother in the most entertaining ways. He talked constantly, and with great enthusiasm. He made friends with every creature on the ranch, whether the creature was interested in friendship or not. He had opinions about everything and was entirely willing to express them. And he found the world an inexhaustibly interesting place, which Lucy thought was the best possible attitude to take toward it. He had her hair exactly, brilliant red, and Marcus's gray eyes, which was a combination that stopped people on the street in Caldwell. George Tucker married Ruth Morrison in June of 1895 in the Caldwell church, and Lucy sat beside Marcus in the pew and watched with the warm satisfaction of someone who had contributed in a small way to something good coming together. George had the same dazed look he'd had over those summer suppers, but more settled now, more certain, and Ruth beside him was quietly radiant. Ada Morrison sat 2 rows ahead, and at one point she turned and found Lucy's eyes, and they exchanged a look that contained the whole history of their friendship. At the reception in the Morrison yard after the ceremony, Frank Morrison pulled Marcus aside for a conversation Lucy couldn't hear, and Marcus listened with his full attention in the way she knew, and when he came back to her side his expression was thoughtful. "Frank wants to talk about what happens to their property when they're gone," Marcus said, low enough that only she could hear. "He wants to know if we'd consider a formal arrangement for the land." Lucy looked at the old couple across the yard, Frank and Ada, who had built their place the same way the Hayes land had been built, by hand and over decades, and who were now at an age where the question of what came next was not a distant one. "That's a serious conversation," she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to have it properly, with you." "Tomorrow evening," she said. "Kitchen table." "Kitchen table," he agreed. They had the conversation with the Morrisons the following week, and it was the kind of conversation that takes several sessions, because it involves people's lives and what they've built, and what they want for it after they're gone. It concluded, over the course of the summer, with a formal agreement that Sundown Ranch would absorb the Morrison property upon Frank and Ada's deaths, with provisions ensuring that Ada would be cared for if Frank went first and vice versa, and that the Morrison name would be maintained in the combined property designation for a period of 25 years, which seemed to Frank and Ada a reasonable honoring of what they'd built. Lucy worked this into the ledger as the largest single change in the ranch's future since its founding, and she worked it carefully and completely. And when she was done, the figures showed a picture that would have seemed impossible to the woman who had arrived in Caldwell 12 years before. Frank Morrison died in the winter of 1897, quietly, in the way of old men who have been ready. Ada came to live with Lucy and Marcus at the Sundown house, in the room that had formerly been Lucy's first room, which they had furnished more comfortably for an older woman. Ada and Lucy spent the mornings together and the evenings sometimes, and the older woman was not a burden in any way but a presence that enriched the house, her 40 years of frontier wisdom available to anyone who sat down with her and was willing to listen. James, who was 12, took to sitting with Ada in the evenings sometimes, listening to her tell about the Kansas of earlier decades, and Lucy would watch through the doorway sometimes and think about the particular richness of old knowledge passing to young attention. In the spring of 1898, Lucy and Marcus sat on the porch on a warm May evening, the roses in first bloom, James inside with a book, Daniel somewhere in the barn where he could usually be found, Penny making her evening rounds of the property with the seriousness of someone who understood her responsibilities. The land stretched away from them in the sunset, good grass, good cattle visible in the far pasture, the barn in excellent repair, the house solid and warm and full. Lucy thought about the advertisement in the Kansas City paper. Wanted, a capable woman for domestic work on a cattle ranch outside Caldwell, Kansas. Wages and room provided. "I want to tell you something," she said. He looked at her, the same look. After 15 years, the same full attention, nothing held back. "I am not afraid of anything," she said. "Not the hard winters or the drought or the cattle markets or the bad years. I have not been afraid of any of it since the first year here, and I think it is because of you." He was quiet for a moment. "That can't be right," he said. "It can," she said. "Not because you protect me from things. You never tried to do that. But because you are here, and you are exactly what you are, all the time, and that is the most solid thing I have ever had in my life." He looked at her for a long moment. The sunset was going through its excessive sequence of amber and rose. "You came to a broken place," he said. "Yes," she said. "And you stayed." "Yes." "Why?" he asked, and it wasn't really a question about the practical reasons, which they both knew. It was the deeper question, the one under everything. She looked at him. This particular man, with his careful hands and his full attention and his inability to say the things he felt without the architecture of dailiness to hold them up. This man who had kept her letter in the left drawer of the desk. "Because broken things are the only kind I know how to love," she said. "And you were not so broken as you thought. You were just waiting for someone who wasn't afraid of the rough parts." He took her hand. His thumb moved across the ring on her finger, the motion so habitual he probably didn't know he did it, and she was aware of it every time because she never wanted to stop being aware of it. "Neither were you," he said. She laughed, and it was the laugh of a woman who knows exactly what her life is and has made her peace with every part of it, and has found that peace to be not a settled resignation but a deep, active joy. "No," she said. "Neither was I." They sat in the last of the evening light, and the roses bloomed along the railing, and somewhere in the barn Daniel's voice carried on the warm air as he explained something to Penny with great enthusiasm. And through the front room window, they could see the lamp that lit the page James was reading, and Ada's shape in her chair in the corner, and the whole of the house breathed around them with the lives that had been built in it. Marcus raised her hand and pressed his lips to the back of it, the ring and the roughened skin, and the 15 years of working and making and staying, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and the Kansas evening came down around Sundown Ranch in all its indiscriminate, excessive beauty. Ada Morrison lived another 4 years, dying peacefully in the summer of 1901, and they buried her beside Frank in the Morrison section, which was now the north portion of the extended ranch. Lucy read from the scripture at the graveside, and James stood with his hat in his hands and his father's serious face. And Daniel stood beside him and held Penny's collar, because Penny had developed the old dog's tendency toward philosophical sitting in the middle of things. The combined Morrison-Sundown operation had, by 1902, grown into one of the more successful mid-sized cattle operations in Sedgwick County, which was not what either Marcus or Lucy would have said they were building toward at any particular point, but was what had grown from building things right. The ledger told a story now that would have seemed like fiction to the woman who had corrected the mathematical errors in the original ledger 12 years before. James, at 17, was Marcus's right hand in the operation with an ease that came from having grown up in it and having paid attention all his life. He had the same natural authority with the animals and the land that his father had, and he had something Marcus had not at that age, which was a woman he loved, a girl named Anna Ferris from the next township, the daughter of a wheat farmer, sensible and warm and entirely worth loving. "He's going to ask her," Marcus said one evening, watching James ride out across the south pasture with the straight-back seat of someone who had been riding before he was properly steady on his feet. "I know," Lucy said. "He told me." Marcus looked at her. "He told you before me. He needed to talk about it with someone and he knew you'd just tell him to ask her," Lucy said. "That's good advice," Marcus said. "It's excellent advice," Lucy said. But he also needed someone to sit with while he thought about it. Marcus was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that when you know, she said. and that the only mistake is waiting so long to say it that you make yourself and the other person miserable for no good reason. He looked at her with that sidelong look. Were you speaking from personal experience? I was speaking from observed experience, she said, meeting his look with her own. James asked Anna Ferris to marry him in October of 1902, sitting on the Sundown porch in the autumn evening with the stars coming out, which he had chosen deliberately because his mother had once told him that she and his father had sat on that porch under the stars, and he had taken this to mean something, which it did. Anna said yes with the immediate conviction of someone who had been ready to say yes for some time, and was glad to finally be asked. The year 1903 brought James and Anna's wedding, and with it, the particular fullness of watching a child you have raised do something that confirms he has become who you hoped he would be. James stood at the church altar with the same expression his father had stood there with 20 years before, which was the expression of a man who cannot believe the thing that is happening but is entirely prepared to believe it. And Lucy, sitting in the pew with Marcus's hand in hers, pressed his fingers and he pressed back. Daniel, at 18, was the best man, and he gave a speech at the reception that was by turns funny and genuinely moving, and everyone was surprised by the moving parts because Daniel was not generally thought of as someone who moved people, only amused them, but there it was. The summer of 1904 brought a new baby to the ranch, James and Anna's first child, a boy they named William after the grandfather buried in the East Field, and Lucy held her grandson for the first time with the same thoroughness of inventory she had brought to holding James, making sure of him, accounting for every finger and the dark hair, and the clear, steady gaze of a baby who had already decided he was interested in what was going on. Marcus held William with the same carefully controlled emotion he had held every small haze, and Lucy watched him and felt the fullness of 20 years together as a single comprehensible thing, not a collection of separate good days but a life, a whole and actual life with weight and texture, and deep roots into the ground they stood on. Daniel, in his way, had been paying attention to a young woman in Caldwell, the daughter of the new school teacher, a girl named Josephine who had her father's intelligence and her own considerable sense of humor, and who was perfectly equipped to be with someone like Daniel, which was to say someone who needed a partner who was not going to be bowled over by his enthusiasm, but who was going to find it as entertaining as it deserved. They married in 1905, which made it 3 weddings in 3 years on the Sundown Ranch family's account, and Lucy made the cake for each one, and attended each one in the deep joy of a woman who knows that what she helped build has extended itself into more life than she could have imagined on the stagecoach coming into Caldwell in the summer of 1883. By 1906, Sundown Ranch had the kind of solidity that came from 23 years of honest work and good faith decisions, and the weathering of difficulty without the abandonment of principle. Marcus was 53, Lucy was 47, and they had between them everything they had promised on the day of that February wedding in the cold Caldwell church, with the bell that had survived its argument with a rifle. They still had their evenings on the porch. This was the constant, the thing that had been established in their first autumn together and had never been broken. They sat together as the sun went down and the Kansas sky did its work, and they talked about the things of the day and the things of the life, and sometimes they sat in the comfortable silence that 20 years of honest knowing can build between two people. "I think about the woman on the stagecoach sometimes," Lucy said one such evening. Marcus looked at her. "What woman?" "The woman I was," she said, "coming into Caldwell, $43 and nowhere particular to go." "I know," he said. "I think about the letter." "You still have it." "Still in the left drawer," he said. She shook her head, smiling. "Marcus Hayes." "Lucy Hayes," he said. And the way he said her name, after all of it, all the years and the drought and the panic and the births and the deaths, and the mornings at 5:30 and the evenings on the porch and the kitchen table and the ledger and the roses and everything. The way he said her name was still the same as the first time he'd said it, standing on the main street of Caldwell in the summer heat with the cracked earth and the thin blue sky, looking at her like she was someone who mattered. "I'm glad I answered the advertisement," she said. "I'm glad you wrote the letter," he said. Penny, old now and gray around the muzzle in the exact same way Senator had been, settled at their feet on the porch boards and sighed the contented sigh of an old dog in the right place. James and Anna were in the house with William, the sound of the baby sometimes reaching them on the evening air. Daniel and Josephine were in their own house now, the former Morrison house on the north section, which had been properly repaired and made into something very like a home. The east field was green in the late summer dusk, and the stone for Marcus's father stood in it, and the stone they had added for Ada Morrison was visible from the porch if you knew where to look. The roses bloomed every summer along the porch railing. The books were on the front room shelf. The letter was in the left drawer of the desk. The land was not broken anymore. Or perhaps more truly, it had always been exactly what it was, a hard and demanding and occasional and magnificent place, and it had broken some of the people who came to it, and it had been broken by others, and that was simply its nature. And the people who stayed were the people who could look at the breaking and understand it to be not the end of the thing but the shape of it, the character of it, the truth of it. Marcus took her hand on the porch railing. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the Kansas evening came down around them as it always had, enormous and indifferent and not unkind. "Still here," she said. "Still here," he agreed. And they were.